This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Hello, and welcome to the show. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the metaphysics of art and beauty. So, I've been thinking a lot about beauty recently, and if you've been following me, you've noticed I've been talking about it. I did a video recently about virtue, and I've been exploring this idea of beauty, and I really got on this rabbit hole with a conversation I had on an earlier episode of the show about Platonism, and it's kind of thrown me into this huge rabbit hole of art and beauty. And I've as a mystical practitioner, as someone who's into this stuff for so long, I've noticed that so much of metaphysics in the West and across the rest of the world are related to, storytelling, art, and all these things. So I wanted to have someone to come on to talk about this with me. We're going to be discussing what beauty is. Is beauty metaphysically real? The spiritual dimension of art, the way that poetry and all this can connect us to things beyond us, and how to develop a spiritual worldview and practice that taps into these things, how to connect to them, and everything around that. So I have a lovely guest. She's a Twitter mutual of mine, and I think she's a lot to say. Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Persephone. On Twitter, I'm Spacerxn, but I am a writer and I also have a background in STEM, like a very heavy background. I just actually completed my degree in biotechnology and cognitive sciences, so I like anything that's the intersection between the humanities and the sciences. I kind of want to return to the whole idea of the Renaissance man where you have it all.
That kind of isn't immediately interesting because if you look into sort of history, the idea of like spirituality, metaphysics, and religion was not always so separate from ideas like science, STEM, as they are now. Like in the modern world, I think we really like dichotomize these things and sort of act like they have completely no relation. But historically, I mean, people have definitely connected the two.
Yeah, for sure. Um, they've been doing that since we were in caves through art, through, sculpture. I mean, beginning with Venus figurines and cave paintings, I think we've always had a way of revering nature, the universe, and personally, if you can't tell by my handle or anything, I'm really into outer space. So I may reference the universe, the cosmos, all of that a lot during this little chat. So I'm really excited to get into it. But first, Georgina, I actually have a question for you about beauty. So I've been following you for a while and your content and everything, and I think it's wonderful. But I want to know what your stance on beauty is. Basically, if you have a more objective or a subjective view of it.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this actually question a lot because, as someone growing up, you always hear the idea of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I kind of assumed that for a while. And, I've started to kind of change my view on it. I think that beauty is, in a way, subjective, right? Like we all have things that we prefer. But I think there is a sort of objective reality to beauty, right? Like it's kind of subjective to a point. And when you think about beauty and you look at all these amazing things, like you mentioned the Venus statues, the paintings from the Hellenistic stuff, like there's something special to it that makes me think that beauty has to have some sort of meaning. And for beauty to have some sort of meaning, that would inherently mean it must exist in some capacity, meaning that it does have to be objective in a sense. Where would you stand on this debate?
I am a huge fan of gray areas, so my opinions on a lot of things are very well, I'm going to go against these two poles and I'm going to make my own little nuanced carved path. And in this question specifically, I would say that there is both an objective and a subjective component to beauty. I mean, if you look at the linguistic roots of the word beauty itself, it's related to, you know, what is good, what is charming, and in some cases even what is holy. So there's that kind of objective beauty that's, I believe, intrinsic within nature. We see that in, you know, patterns on leaves following the Fibonacci spiral beautifully. The way, you know, the moon controls the tides. There's so many instances in nature that just prove that there has to be a more objective standard to beauty, but that doesn't mean that to an individual, to a human, um, you know, to different beings, that there can't be variance between what one considers beautiful versus what another person considers beautiful. I think we can all have like a different perception, but there is kind of um, a standard that's, if you believe in any sort of higher powers, it's kind of set by that. So that's kind of my view on it. And I have very scattered spiritual and philosophical beliefs, which I will get into in a bit. But um, from my perspective, at least, as someone who does believe in higher powers within the universe, and the power of the universe within itself, I would say that there is kind of like a cosmic standard almost, you know, for beauty. Like there's so many things you can just see and declare like that is beautiful or that is ugly, right, without, you know, looking further into it. And then there are a lot of different entities and things where we can find hidden beauty. So something that may look ugly on the surface level may, you know, hide beauty on the inside, and that's kind of where the whole beauty derived from the meaning of goodness comes in, because you could have the ugliest um thing and it's still beautiful on the inside. Like if you take a really ugly plant, for example, um and you dissect it a bit, well, the plant is still giving life, it's giving oxygen, it's providing others with life, it's providing others with the means to create beauty. So I think beauty is something that could be internally and externally found in both subjective and objective ways.
I would pretty much agree with that. I think that it's a little bit more complicated than beauty being entirely objective, because the first time someone said to me, beauty is objectively real, I sort of had this like immediate response like, well, how can it be? Because when I go to a museum with my boyfriend, we did pick different like favorite paintings. Then I started thinking about it a little bit more and I was like, but there is still that detection that we all have. I'm a polytheist religiously, and I sort of hold this belief that, you know, there is sort of divinity in everything. We all have a spark of divinity in us. And I think when we look at beauty, we are seeing a reflection of the goodness of the gods. Since we have that bit of divinity in us, we can immediately sort of on a deeper level recognize it and spot it and know what it is. I think beauty is one of those things when you see it, you sort of know it. While we, I say, would have taste, like certain things we're going to find more beautiful than others on a personal level, we still kind of know what beauty is when we see it. And I think that there's a reason why we immediately can recognize what it is, even if it's not necessarily like our favorite variants of what beauty is.
Beauty, especially if you're looking at it from an artistic perspective, like you said, you know, you go into a museum and with another person and you both have different favorite paintings, and that happens and that's natural. I was gonna mention actually the work of Umberto Eco, who wrote about the open art based on his philosophy of the open work, which really has to do with how someone interprets a piece of art or literature, any creative endeavor. What Eco says is that every piece of art is has this quality of openness, and that based on your own life experiences, I believe that aesthetics in general are something that needs to be experienced and lived. Like, when you look at a piece of beautiful art, you should be immersed in that. You should be, placing your own thoughts in that painting or that sculpture or that poem you read. And it's really up to you and your own perspective to derive value and meaning from whatever you're observing.
So I remember when I was newer to the spirituality stuff, the religion stuff, I had this sort of idea that if someone is really focused on aesthetics in their spiritual worldview, their spiritual practice, they're like basically kind of shallow. And I now want to like kick younger me. I want to be like, what are you talking about? Because if you look at the ancient world, you see that people were always connecting their religious worldview and their religious perspective to art and using art to experience it. Like there's a reason why in all these cultures there were these statues that were used as basically representations of these spirits, and that people would then use those statues to help them connect to the actual spirit. And you see this now in the modern world in quite a few traditions. And it's so clear that art and imagery and aesthetics really can be used as a gateway to something higher, because you're right, when you connect to an aesthetic you are sort of experiencing that thing. Even if it's simply looking at something, you're able to connect to it on a deeper level. And that's why I think art can actually be used as a gateway into much higher things.
Oh, definitely. I believe that art is just, if you've ever heard of the quote, "The arts are the signature of civilization," I think they're more of a cornerstone to civilization, more than we give it credit for, more than we accept it as, especially in the modern world. We're really caught up in technology and everything. And I would argue that technology and innovation is a different type of beauty. Um, but I also think that um, basically uh, we do have these connections with pieces of art. Like, in my own experiences growing up, we've always had an altar to all of these different Hindu deities, and so I grew up learning how to do the rituals, and for every like puja or celebration, any sort of prayer, um, we use idols in the form of little statues, and then we have big festivals where there's just a bunch of these idols that are beautifully crafted. And for Durga Puja, which is the main festival for Hindu Bengalis from the region of India my family is from, uh, they celebrate the week of the puja by going to these pandals and revering the goddess, and praying and giving offerings. And then at the end of the festival, there's supposed to be a symbolism of rebirth, and that's why at the end of the festivals they take all of those statues, all of those pieces of art that were created for worship, and they go in they used to do like processions to the river, but now they just, get rid of it in the river, and it's a cleansing thing and practice. And I don't know how in the past few years if things have changed. They're environmental activists and stuff who would probably be like, don't throw a statue into the river. So I'm not sure how they do that now, but at least when I was growing up, it would always be like, we take the statues and we put them into the river. And it's also a Hindu tradition to be cremated rather than buried, like, much of the Western world, because of that whole cleansing nature of fire and that whole idea of being reborn as something more beautiful than in your past life, depending on, how you lived your current life. So I draw my spiritual beliefs from a lot of different traditions and philosophies. Like, I don't follow, simply Hinduism. There are things I don't agree on in Hinduism.
Yeah, I have a very perennialistic view of things. I think that there's a lot of beauty to be found everywhere. And it's really clear if you look at stuff from around the world, even in cultures that didn't interact, that there's some clear sort of inner core that I feel like we're all kind of getting at and sort of interpreting. And on the statue idol thing, it's so interesting how idols and statues are basically, they function as a microcosm for something bigger. They can, on a physical level, represent these much more, broad and vague things. And it's so interesting how in the physical world we can sort of replicate that with these things. I think that there's something very profound even about creating a piece of, an idol or a piece of sacred art, because in a sense you are sort of like the gods, creating something or doing something generative. And I think that in and of itself has a sort of spiritual value to it. I remember a while ago I started writing devotional poetry to some of the gods that I honor. And I was working through it, and I was writing this one poem to Apollo, and I could like feel myself like it almost was like a trance, like hypnotic, meditative, spiritual experience just creating that. And I was like reading it back and I was like, yeah, this is a poem I wrote, but there's something more to it. And so I think it's beautiful that there's an entire festival where people are doing that, because it is like there's something profound about creating art with that spiritual dimension to it. Because I think there's something spiritual in and of itself whenever we create something, right?
Yes, I actually differentiate between the act of creation and the act of making.
How
Um,
so?
so I have this long-standing hatred for the phrase content creator, because of the nature of what that content usually is, how it's made, and how it's distributed. It's usually in a very shallow way, and I think that true real art, like anything that has stood the test of time, whether it be a literary work, whether it be fine arts or a film, there is some degree of um there is some degree of standards there, that differentiate what is made and mass produced, um, versus what is made with the intention of honoring, the greater universe's language. Like, I believe that creating art is to honor these higher powers, to kind of imitate them in a revering kind of way, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. I've used the term content creator and I've seen a lot of critique of it. And some of it I think is pretty legitimate as a term. But that sort of raises another question I have. Do you think like there's an objective line of what is art versus what is like making something? Do you think there's like, because you were describing it with kind of a spiritual tone to it. So do you think like art is inherently spiritual and then making things or when things are not spiritual? Where would you draw that line?
I've never considered that specific question before, but um, I would differentiate between those two paths by saying that anything that is created, what, you know, um, is constitutive of a piece of art is that great love and great suffering went into it. Like you have to suffer, you have to hate like pretty much every second of whatever artistic passion that you have, but you have to also deeply love it. That like that turmoil that it takes on you emotionally to create something beautiful, I believe, is what separates a real piece of art from something that's kind of an imitation or like more able to be you know, more able to generate mass appeal. So, you know, a piece of real art, I don't know, I'm just going to give the example of Dante's Divine Comedy, like the self torture that went into the creation of that piece of work is what makes it shine as such a prominent piece of art. You can argue that, um, you know, Hellenistic literature, like the Homeric hymns, they're all pieces of art and they're stories of God suffering, sure, but it's also, you know, the author, the person telling those epics or writing those hymns, like in this case Homer, like you have to have this deep reverence and admiration that you as a human must suffer a bit to attain kind of universal perfection, quote unquote.
Yes. And I think in the modern world, we're always afraid of suffering. I think people have a serious fear of it. But if you look at anything that's worthwhile in the world, you kind of do have to suffer a little bit. I think that we're sometimes terrified of the prospect of doing something hard in order to create something that's even better for our lives and that can, make the suffering sort of worth it. I think we've kind of forgotten that notion. But on Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno in particular is something that has entered people's like psyche in such a way that even though that was written as a piece of art, people consider it like in the West, like the Christian view of hell is largely colored by Dante, which is so wild to me because
I know,
that was not
right?
the Bible. That was not, technically a proper religious text, but it's taken on with time this really, I don't know, religious connotation. I feel like people see that as a sort of mythology of sorts in a strange way. And so it's crazy how a piece of art that's done so well can take on such a deep dimension because obviously the Homeric hymns, which you also mentioned, have a seriously deep religious context to them, right? Like I have used many
Mhm.
of those hymns myself in my personal spiritual practice and have had really
Same here.
incredible results with them. Like they truly do something. And it's so fascinating how, a piece of art can sort of become more than art, right? Like, obviously, you can appreciate the beauty when you look at it, when you read it, but it can enter, our brains in a way where it can almost, like, in a very bizarre way, kind of manifest itself into the real world, which is just incredible that we're able to do that.
On the subject of the Divine Comedy, actually, Dante, um, uh, if you boil it down, it's a story all about beauty. Beatrice is this, you know, this symbol of goodness and truth and virtue and all things beautiful in a spiritual way. Um, it's all, you know, beauty coming from the tongue of God almost. And um, Beatrice even reminds Dante to not see her as the end point of beauty, but rather what she's there to do, which is to guide him on this deeply spiritual journey. And that's why she has gone down historically and in a literary sense um as this ultimate symbol of all that is beautiful. And it's a great example of holiness being incorporated into beauty. And I also, if you read about Dante's life and the actual Beatrice in his life, it's kind of a sad story of unrequited love. And that's kind of played on in uh throughout La Commedia. So I find that very interesting. And I don't know, I see a lot of irony in how the Divine Comedy is interpreted, but for me it's probably, I see it as kind of a very spiritual text. At least in my own life, it opened my eyes to so many things. And I don't know, I have a whole thing for Dante stuff that I could go on all day about. But um yeah, I just think that there there's beauty, and there are different, subcategories of beauty, or different types of beauty.
Yeah,
um do you know what I'm trying to say?
I
Like,
know what
I
you
can't
mean.
I can't think of like specific categories. Like, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not going to try to invent categories of beauty. But like what I was saying earlier about how technological innovation can be a beautiful thing if the process is, you know, done in a beautiful way, in a way that honors nature, in a way that honors humanity. I believe that technological progress can be beautiful, but right now in this day and age, we have dissociated so far in the scientific world from, philosophy and theology and um, classical studies, that it's really difficult for some of these, tech CEOs, or, in my industry, the biotech, aerospace industry. Um, it's everything is very cold, clear cut, clinical. There's no room for, different interpretation. And I my goal is to change that.
I've been kind of critical of technology, and I've had quite a few people call me a Luddite. And I wouldn't actually agree with that. My critique of technology is that I think progress for the sake of progress is not necessarily good. I think with progress, if you're doing it just to progress instead of for some sort of deeper reason, I think that it can be actually counter to human development, growth, and prosperity. I think that with developing technology, we need to do it in a way that makes people's lives better. Otherwise, we create, the situation that we're now where there's a lot of, alienation and all this stuff. And so I think that when we talk about technological progress, we need to put that meaning back to it, because I think there's this kind of lie that people have in the modern world that all progress is inherently good. And that's just not true.
Yeah.
Progress needs a purpose, or otherwise, it can actually be extremely destructive. And I really wish people in the tech sectors were thinking in that way so that they could be like, okay, is this invention going to make people's lives better? How can we invent things that actually make people's lives better instead of just sort of doing things for the sake of doing things?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. You've stated that perfectly, that, progress should not be for simply the sake of progress. Progress um can be good, and it has a positive connotation to it, usually, especially these days. Like, everything, everything that's seen as good these days is tied to the idea of progress. But at what point does that progress become more like an agenda, or poisoned by, petty politics and people injecting their own, like very metaphysically devoid philosophies into making new technologies? That's where I disagree with, the industry um that I've been involved with. And I want to, I want to help change that in any way that I can. And um getting back to the whole Renaissance man thing, I believe that we need those people who are doing research, who are creating new inventions, who are innovating upon existing technologies. I think a lot of these people need to sit down and read some philosophy, read some theology, think about what they're really doing and why they're doing it. Like, if you don't have a concrete why as to what you're working on, then I don't think you're creating something of real value or real meaning. I think you're just doing it in a self-serving way. And I'm not going to say that doing things for yourself or selfishness is inherently a bad thing, but um in order for humanity to have a better future, which I really hope for, um, there has to be more people um, who are thinking more along the lines of, humanism and religiosity. How can we tie that into whatever projects, whatever missions we're working towards?
Absolutely. This reminds me of something that I used to see a lot when I was sort of involved with the kind of, I don't know what to call it, the more mainstream, I guess, side of the spiritual community, whatever you want to call that. Is a lot of people were getting into spirituality, especially people who I would guess kind of describe as more new age leaning. And what they would do is they would do practices and they do rituals and stuff like that, right? And they'd be like, well, I'm gonna do this ritual because it's a full moon, and so I'm gonna do it. And I remember I would ask these people a lot, I'd be like, well, why? What is your aim? To what end are you doing this? Like, well, I'm just doing it. And I'm like, when you're becoming a spiritual person, when you're developing, when you're trying to grow anything, because much like technological progress, on the personal level, when you are being spiritual, you're trying to grow yourself, you're trying to develop, you're trying to progress, essentially. And if you don't have a meaning for why you're doing something, it's going to feel aimless. It's not going to be as productive as it could be. And so I used to always try to drill into people's heads, why are you doing this? What is the reasoning behind this? Because as you were saying with the Renaissance man thing, I think sometimes, and I think actually social media has made this worse, we think of life as these compartmentalized niches, whatever you want to call them, right? We're like, oh, this is science, this is religion, this is art, and they're all separate. They're all in their pretty little boxes. But in reality, that's not really how the world works, because our inner values inform everything, and our beliefs are going to inform how we see everything else. And so in reality, all this stuff has all these dimensions to it, right? And I think sometimes we forget to think in that way because we're so focused on putting things in pretty little boxes, because that is a neater way of viewing the world, right? It's easy to be like, well, that's science, that's religion, that's art, that's philosophy, but they're not separate. There's no real separation between all of it because it all informs each other. So, yeah.
I'm trying to think of different writers and philosophers and artists who kind of went along with that notion of, becoming the apex between the natural world and, further creation. I think it's really a multi dimensional aspiration, really, to return to the Renaissance man. And the problem is everything is so specialized these days. Um, like y- I'm in the process of you know, uh starting my career out, and everything is just so specific, and it's like I can do more than this. I could add some flair to this. I could turn this completely upside down, and we could do it in a new way. And I think that that's just something that, you know, the exponential growth of technology has kind of limited us in a way, in how we view ourselves and how we view the projects we work on, whether it be through our careers or how we even treat our families, how we address spirituality and religion. There are just so many different ways that, um, you know, information is at our fingertips, yet we are more uneducated than we've ever been, because you can just look something up in 5 seconds on your phone anywhere in the world, pretty much. And I think, you know, part of the most important aspects of, you know, exploring beauty and exploring knowledge is having to go through the process of searching and researching and, you know, putting things into practice, like spiritual ideas. You need to be living out these things. You can't just be Googling and going to your nearest, I don't know, Hot Topic or whatever and buying crystals. Um, there has to be some sort of underlying holistic goal behind whatever it is that you're trying to reach and ascend towards. Really, really, it's, you know, Maslow's hierarchy is, you know, it could be spiritually reformed into basically a pyramid of, you know, spiritual fulfillment at the top, and you have to climb up all of these ladders to reach that point. And it's important to be very holistic in how you climb up that ladder. Like, you have to be able to look at things in interdisciplinary ways. Like, I am a huge proponent of interdisciplinary learning.
Oh, yeah. I think that we really do need to realize that interdisciplinary thinking and learning is just reality, right? Things all just bleed together. That's just the state of the world and how things tend to work. I remember when I started this new podcast, I had some people say to me like, "Georgina, you're a religion blogger. Why are you talking so much about philosophy? Why are you occasionally talking about related ideas like politics?" Yes, and I was like, they're all interconnected. And when you say that they're not interconnected, you fall into the hot topic crystal girl thing, right? Where you're like, okay, I want to change my life. I want to become someone who is tapped into these higher currents. I want to understand the meaning of the universe. But I'm not going to change my lifestyle. I'm not going to look into what this means philosophically to me. I'm just going to buy the rose quartz and hope that, my life gets better and I become enlightened. That's not how it works. That rose quartz can be spiritually beneficial. I'm not going to say throw out your crystals or, having a spiritual discipline and actual practice is really good. I talk about it constantly for a reason, but you need to do more than that because a true successful spiritual life is going to bleed into other parts of your life, right? Your physical health, your mental health, your spiritual health, you following your values, all of that is really interconnected. And when you get deep enough into this stuff, you have to realize that sometimes you're going to have to change more than what exactly you're doing in your spiritual practice to fully have spiritual growth because it is all encompassing, right? the goal of all this stuff, it's gnosis, it's getting close to God, it's whatever your goal is, there's something higher than using that crystal. And if you're just using that crystal, you're not going to reach that endpoint that you're aspiring to reach with all this stuff.
What do you think, not to go off on a tangent from, what we're supposed to be talking about, but what do you think of all these mostly Gen Z people um, on TikTok? I don't use TikTok, so I don't know, but I've seen like screenshots to where I kind of get an idea of what's going on that side of spirituality, but like this modern day like, oh, I'm gonna buy all these crystals off of Amazon and burn some sage and
Yeah, I have kind of complicated feelings about it because a lot of people completely laugh and disregard it. And I don't agree with that perspective. I think that what it is and what's going to happen and what's already happening now, because the reality is that big spiritual TikTok boom has already passed, right? We are on the downturn of that. It peaked about a year and a half ago. And what I said then, and what I still stand by, is a lot of people are going to get exposed to this stuff. Not a lot of them are going to stick with it. What's going to happen is people get into it, they buy their crystals off Amazon, and some of them are going to get, really into it. And they're going to be like, you know what? I want to go deeper. I want to explore deeper. And they're going to become spiritually adept and devote their lives to this stuff. The rest of them, they're probably going to have it as a hobby or like keep a couple crystals in the corner of their room and move on. I don't really have a problem with that. I think that that's pretty harmless. Like, I do get annoyed because a lot of misinformation has been spread by those people, and in certain ways, certain things have been diluted and watered down, but the real mysteries are always there. And those who want to seek that, I mean, it can be kind of a gateway drug. And so I'm not mad about it. The thing that frustrates me about it is the amount of misinformation that those people go on to spread. But I mean, I feel like it's better people are exposed to it that way than not at all. Because, if you get into it that way, there are people who have gone deeper and become, pretty impressive practitioners and mystics. So I don't know. I'm not mad at it, but I think that there are some problems with it. I think it's a lot more nuanced than lol, the crystal girls are cringe, or this is the spiritual revival of the world. Like it's more nuanced than that.
I I just find it very amusing that the things that I was shunned for growing up are now popular, and the people that I see partaking in these spiritual activities and practices are not really doing so from an educated standpoint, and that's what I agree with you on, is the misinformation that you know a lot of these platforms are spreading. But like I said, I'm not into TikTok or anything, so I only see what comes up on my Twitter feed, and I can't say I'm any better because I'm just on a different platform posting about similar things, but at least when I try to post, I make sure I do my research, I do my homework before I post something, that I think is stupid or is spreading misinformation. Like, I will double and triple check to make sure what I'm posting anywhere is accurate, or as accurate as possible. But that's just me being neurotic, I guess. Um, but um, I do think that the younger generations getting more into spirituality, whatever way they choose, is a good thing. It's very much needed, whether it's even fake or for the sake of social media. Like, I think the fact that it's around and being spread is probably a good thing for um changing this mindset of everything has to be, a job, everything has to be a very concrete thing, everything has to make you money. um I think it's kind of y- I think it's kind of more beneficial to the collective mindset to embrace spiritual traditions, especially if, your family has some sort of deep roots or connections. And it's also a great way to get more into your roots and um, your ancestry. Like, I grew up completely basically rejecting my family's um religion and everything. Like, I was never forced to partake in any religious holiday or festival or anything growing up. My parents allowed me to be very free in what I read, what I believed in. And so I think that has some pros to it and some cons to it. If I feel like if I were raised in a very strictly religious household, I would have more of a clear set of beliefs and practices. But since I kind of grew up exploring and dipping my toes into all sorts of practices and traditions, it kind of made me confused in a spiritual way for a long time. Like, what do I actually believe in? And then, um, last year maybe, or the year before, oh my gosh, COVID like is messing my brain up. I actually did my thesis in the philosophy of panpsychism, connecting it to biotechnology, which I studied as a major. And when I was doing all that research into panpsychism as a philosophy, I kind of developed more spiritual beliefs, more solid spiritual beliefs at the very least, because the whole idea of panpsychism is how far can we extend consciousness. And I believe that, there have been studies, and newer studies are emerging like crazy, of quantum particles being able to, exhibit some form of quote unquote consciousness, when interacted with in specific ways like light beams or lasers and things like that. There are actual, scientific studies going on in that area. And I I think that that's a really good direction for science to be going in, is to explore these philosophical problems, like how can we tackle the hard problem of consciousness. I view consciousness as kind of a knot that needs to be untangled. And uh, there's this great quote about, to paraphrase, by William Seeger, about um, watching the world wake up when you start viewing consciousness as something that is beyond humans and as an intrinsic property of the universe itself. And this can be tied back to, like, even Plato. You can argue that some of Plato's thoughts were foundations for early panpsychism. There's medieval Sanskrit philosophy that goes into the soul and outward action and how that relates to consciousness. And now we have the more scientific perspective from Tononi and Koch, where it's the integrated information theory, IIT. And that's what I was getting at with the whole lights and lasers, exciting, these subatomic particles and things like that. I do believe that the further you choose to extend consciousness to, the more of a spiritual connection that you'll make with the universe. Because if you're believing that there are specific causal activities going on in the universe combined with, the elements of chaos and whatnot, you end up with a pretty broad view of what consciousness is and what it can be. And really, the arguments that are had over this are all semantics.
So, my final thoughts are that beauty is a lot more than something being pretty. Beauty has this deep spiritual dimension to it, and it connects to everything, right? The beauty and the aesthetics of something can tap into something so much deeper and can help us understand the world in a way that our modern minds often forget. There is more to the world than just the material, and I think as humans, we always need to understand that and reckon with that.
Exactly. And I think that's where I don't want to go too far into this, but I think that's where practices like astrology really come in, because I don't think you can create something meaningful without going through a very deep level of self reflection and introspection. And I think astrology allows people to really explore different facets in their personality, in their past lives, based on your 12th house and what's prominent within your personality, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and you know like taking the Mercury signs and your Mars signs into account, how you think and how you act. I think understanding those planets and understanding your placements in those two planets specifically really can help you pursue both realistic and spiritual goals that you have in mind. And um Ficino has a lot of text on this. And as far as beauty goes, I think Simone Weil's writings on beauty and love and God are very much worth reading. And I have to always recommend the short story The Aleph. If you care about beauty, if you care about knowledge, and if you care about the philosophies behind all of that, that is like a 35-page required reading, because um everything is found within one point. Like the universe exists as one point and is maximized from there. Um, I actually have an essay on my Substack, kind of like tying into those similar ideas. And actually, I want to wrap this up with my pinned tweet that I've had forever, which is the macroscopic universe exists within the micro world of poetry. I chose to write that about poetry because that's what I'm passionate about, but I think that phrase could be applied to any sort of artistic or beauty related uh project or goal. You know the entire universe is supposed to be represented through whatever you create, with the ideas of poesis specifically. That's what I base my entire creative process on. You know, I've gotten asked by so many, like, in real life friends and family members, why don't you publish your writing, why don't you just send to magazines and things like that. And it's so hard to explain that, no, I have to have all of this come out after I'm, like, dead, like, for people to see the process that went behind it. Like, I want everything I create to be real, true art. And I think I have a long ways to go personally and spiritually before I feel comfortable, having my works published, even though that's a dream of mine one day. Um, I I stray away from it now because I think there's so much room for improvement and spiritual growth personally, that I just don't want to make impulsive decisions and put out things that are not aligned with my values out into the world.
Lovely. And with that, where's your corner of the internet? Where can people find you?
Uh, well, I do have a link tree in my Twitter bio that takes you to a few different places. But on Twitter, if you want to follow me, I am Space Reaction, Space RXN, which is, in my world, reaction. That's the shorthand for that. So that's what my handle means if you've been reading it as Space RXN or whatever. Um, uh, so you can find me there. I have a master thread of threads that I reshare every now and then when I get an influx of a few followers. I tend to retweet that. So I have a lot of threads on different things like art, poetry, logos, esoterica, mythology, all sorts of things. And um, it's it's a really good place to start to find um, recommended readings that I would say that everybody should get their hands on. I have, like, a lot of excerpts and original writings on my page if you want to check that out. And I also have a Substack that I'm going to be posting way more consistently onto. I have a philosophy of aesthetics account on Instagram, called Peony Palace, because that's what I call the inside of my mind. Um, the link to that is also in my bio on Twitter, through my link tree. And lastly, I have a SoundCloud where I take on all these different alter egos, and I kind of have a little world going on where I'm making mixtapes and demos. So if you want to check out some of my weird music about the underworld and uploading your mind to the cloud, that's where to find me there. But it was great chatting with you tonight. And I am so honored that you invited me to be on your podcast. I won't lie, I freaked out and started shaking uncontrollably when you did. So I had a
Oh,
great
that's
time.
so sweet. Thank you so much for coming on. I am
Yeah.
Georgina Rose. I go by Dot Darling on the internet. If you're new to the show, you can find me on this show. Obviously, I do this podcast, but I'm also on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Substack, Twitch, Odyssey, Telegram, and I think that's it. I have a Patreon where you can support me. If you support the show's Patreon, you get the episodes early. You get extra episodes every Sabbath or so, allegedly. And you get the pre-show, which is a sort of mini thing that I do. You get a solo mini podcast from me every episode. And if you are of a high enough tier, I will read your name out. So special thanks, though, you do have to tell me if you don't want your name read. I know some people like anonymity. Thank you to Emil, Neva, Lilith, Jonah, Nauseated, and Lee. Thank you so much for your continued support. And thank you so much for listening, and have a lovely day, night, afternoon, mid morning, evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. All right. See you in 2 weeks.